Okay, why don't we begin? So, welcome all of you. My name is Randy Vanderhoof. I'm the Executive Director of the EMV Migration Forum. I'm very pleased that you were able to join us today for this webinar on near-term solutions to address the growing threat of card-not-present fraud. Next slide. So before we get into the content here and the introduction of the panelists, I'd just like to give you a quick overview of the EMV Migration Forum and focus of today's webinar. So the EMV Migration Forum was formed back in September of 2012. And so we're now 3 years and 18 gatherings of the EMV Migration Forum later. And the organization participants are focusing on addressing the issues that require broad cooperation and coordination across the entire payments market to ensure a successful adoption of EMV-enabled cards, devices, and terminals, and to ensure that this migration in the U.S. market is efficient, timely, and cost-effective. We have over 175 members with over 600 individual active member participants, representing the global payment brands, issuers, merchants, processors, regional debit networks, and a host of technology providers. And through various educational programs using web resources, workshops, webinars, media briefings, and in-person meetings, we're raising the awareness of EMV and helping consumers, issuers, merchants, and payment services providers prepare for the EMV migration that's happening. One of the most important issues that the EMV migration supports is how to manage and mitigate fraud that EMV does not address but impacts every stakeholder, which is card-not-present fraud. And that's going to become the focus of today's webinar. Next slide. So we've gathered 3 subject matter experts from our EMV Migration Forum organization, and you'll be hearing from Francine Dubois, who is our VP of Global Sales and Partnerships with Nagra ID Security, Rodman Reif, who's founder and managing principal of Reif Carson Consulting, and Niraj Gupta, who's senior product manager with Vantav's e-commerce group. Next slide. So our agenda for today is to cover what card-not-present fraud is like in an EMV environment, and talk about some of the methodologies that are used to reduce and mitigate card-not-present fraud, including some of the authentication methods and fraud prevention tools that are out there, and to focus further attention on specific technologies like tokenization and 3D Secure, which have proven to be effective in managing card-not-present fraud in an EMV world. And then we have some wrap-up and conclusions about where we see next steps are for the industry to continue to address this challenging and growing fraud problem as we also work to address the physical fraud that happens in the retail environment. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the webinar objective, and if you could turn to the next slide. The focus of our webinar today is really to provide information to industry stakeholders on the current tools and best practices for securing the card-not-present fraud channel, which can be implemented in parallel with what is going on today in the U.S. EMV conversion. So we're going to focus in this webinar on the techniques that are currently available and talk about some additional techniques that are under development and scheduled to be available in late 2016 and beyond. And some others that are currently out of scope but on the radar screen for implementation and changed in the future. So for those of you who were not aware, the EMV Migration Forum published a white paper on this topic fairly recently, and that white paper is available for anyone on the EMV-Connection website. So I'm going to now turn over to the presentation to our next presenter, who is Francine Dubois. I'll be coming back at the end of this presentation to field your questions and have the panelists be able to respond to those questions. So next slide, please.
Thank you, Randy. So we're going to start talking a little bit about card not present fraud in an EMV world. So in the next slide, you'll see a quote that pretty much sums it up. At the end of the day, card not present fraud is nothing new. It's been around in various forms for many years. However, fraud attempts in the CNP environment are expected to increase for several reasons. Not only EMV chip technology, as it's being adopted, will push things to the weakest link, but also the sheer growth of e-commerce itself, which we all know is not going anywhere and is only increasing. So why does EMV technology have anything to do with card not present fraud? It's very simple. It focuses on card present or face-to-face transactions and handles that very well. The bad guys, however, are going to look for where they can make money, and they're going to go in other channels where the authentication is much weaker, and that includes today card not present environment, which is a combination of the internet, the major one, but also mail order and telephone order, sometimes referred to as iMoto. So let's look at what happened in other countries, since that's where we're going to start, and then eventually deal with the US. So on the next slide, you can see two different graphs. So on the left, look at the UK, graph A. That was one of the first countries who migrated to EMV. So if you look at the blue line at the top, that represents card not present fraud. In the UK, the move to EMV payments did not tackle card not present authentication at all, which means that it resulted in a rapid growth of card not present fraud from the start of the EMV deployment in the early 2000s until it peaked in 2008. It's actually interesting to know that the card not present fraud actually tripled in itself, but leveled out before leveling out and then declining. But at the same time, the CNP transactions actually grew tenfold. So in some ways, the fraud actually went down significantly. So why did it go down? Starting in 2008, they implemented merchants and banks and the various parties 3D Secure, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Rod will cover it. So that had something to do with the decline, as well as the magnetic stripe locations only declined across Europe, therefore reducing the opportunity to use those cards in a card not present environment. It still is interesting to know that as of 2012, the card not present fraud still represented 63% of total fraud losses in the UK, and that's pretty consistent around Europe. And as we can see in the next slide, other European countries kind of followed in the same pattern. We have data not shown here that shows that just like in the UK, France, Australia had a card not present fraud that increased as a percentage of the overall fraud during and after the EMV conversion, whereas the EMV cards themselves reduced the card present fraud issues, which was obviously the intent. So the card not present fraud numbers eventually went down after various authentication methods were implemented. So now we're going to focus on the chart to the right on the next slide, Spain. Spain, unlike any other country at that time in Europe, did something very different. Try to look for the blue line, and you'll notice that it's totally at the bottom. It actually is almost inexistent with 4% of the total fraud, whereas the counterfeit fraud, the yellow line, is significantly higher. Incidentally, Spain also suffered from a very high percentage of lost and stolen cards that also got dealt with, in terms of with EMV. So why was there actually very little focus on very little fraud in terms of CNP? Just because they took a totally different approach. They actually focused on card not present fraud, and as a result, they did not follow the pattern that they saw everywhere else. And eventually, when they implemented EMV, that took care of the counterfeit and lost and stolen fraud. So what does it mean for the US, which in the next slide? We don't have numbers yet, obviously, since the EMV migration, as you know, is in progress. But the fact of the matter is the US, unlike others coming last, has the opportunity to learn from those previous EMV migrations and to address the EMV migration in tandem, that rollout in tandem with card not present fraud. And it's extremely important for the U.S. as they are today. They have the highest e-commerce spend per person in the world. So it's really wide open for fraud if nothing is dealt with. So into the next section will be handled by Rod, and he will talk about the methodology, how we got to the various authentication methods and tools that secure the card not present channel, and focus on card not present, the e-commerce transactions mainly, meaning transactions that originate from desktop computers, laptops, tablets, and mobile phones. And I just want to say, and Rod will reiterate probably, that we will not specifically address the emerging mobile payments environment. So Rod, I'll leave it up to you.
So thank you, Francine. I think just to add one thing to what Francine said, the techniques that we have here are very good for e-commerce in general. They are also applicable to some of the mail, well, a few of them are applicable to the mail order and telephone order environment, but most are not. So what we did is that we used the same technique for both authentication methods as well as fraud tools, and we chose about 27 factors for determining the effectiveness and success of each method or tool. From those 27 factors, we rated each of the fraud tools and authentication methods that were brought to our attention. The 27 factors, some of them include ease of integration, user friendliness, strength of security, impact on abandonment rates, etc. We had 3 stakeholder groups do the evaluation. We had merchants and acquirers, issuers, and networks and brands. They independently scored each method and tool against the key factors. The scores were totaled. The top scoring methods and tools were identified. So that should give you an idea about how the top-rated tools were chosen. And I'll now discuss the 4 authentication tools that had the best scores. So in this section, we will address the device authentication, one-time passwords, randomized PIN pad, and biometrics. The order of the discussion does not represent the relative score of the methods, and it doesn't represent any other priority. These are just the 4 top-scoring methods. And following the discussion of the authentication methods, we'll discuss the fraud tools, and Niraj will take us through that. So, in terms of the authentication methods, the first one is device authentication, also known as device fingerprinting. Device authentication authenticates a device used to access an e-commerce device. The data points that can be evaluated include IP address, device type, browser version, etc. And it's based upon multiple data points, as you just heard, acquired either before or during a transaction. Typically, the consumer is not aware of the process unless the device is not recognized. And the device authentication is usually performed by the merchant or the merchant's vendor. If you want to protect against a counterfeit or lost and stolen cards, this particular authentication method doesn't do it, and you need other authentication methods for protection against those 2 items. But this authentication method does ensure that the device that's being used is one which is recognized. And I think all of us in our daily work have seen this in a number of environments. So the next authentication method is one-time passwords. The one-time password is a unique string of numbers or letters which is valid for only one transaction. And the one-time passwords, also known as OTPs, prevent replay attacks and other fraudulent transactions. The OTPs are generated by algorithms and can be delivered through a hardware device. Believe it or not, they can still be delivered on paper, and in certain environments they are. Text messages, email, and other web-based channels. The algorithms that are used can be mathematical, time synchronized, etc. So when the delivery uses a different channel than the transaction, and an OTP can be effective, an effective component of two-factor authentication. And OTPs are usually generated and authenticated by the card issuer. So most of us have used an OTP that has been sent to us by text, email, or phone. There are new dynamic CVV cards that are in the market. That gives you an example of a one-time password. And the card that's shown at the bottom right is an advanced and somewhat expensive version of an OTP card. It has the same form factor as a credit or debit card. It has a keypad and a small display. The keypad's on the bottom left of the card, and the display is on the top right. When a PIN is entered using the keypad, so when your personal identification number is entered in the keypad, an OTP is displayed in the top right. And unfortunately, due to the expense, this is not widely used yet, but it is used by certain banks in certain circumstances. So the next method we're going to talk about is a random PIN pad. And the randomized PIN pad provides a floating PIN pad on the merchant's checkout page for consumers who use a PIN-enabled debit or credit card for e-commerce transactions. It can also be used with OTPs, one-time PINs, one-time passwords. The consumer uses either a mouse, their finger, or another pointing device to enter the PIN. The location numbers on the PIN pad change with each transaction, with each number that's entered. And the only thing that's transmitted are encrypted XY coordinates. They're converted to an industry standard PIN in a hardware security module in a secure data center. So the consumer's PIN is never in the clear. The 2 points about this to emphasize are the location numbers on the PIN pad change each time a number is entered, and only the XY coordinates are transmitted, and they are encrypted before they are transmitted. So the next method that I will talk about is really a group of methods called biometrics. So biometrics uses a unique feature of a consumer's hand, voice, face, veins, or eye. Examples might include for the hand, a fingerprint, for the eye, retina or iris. And so the biometric information is typically transmitted and should be transmitted over a secure channel. 3DS, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is a possibility of a secure channel for delivery. And the transmission should use a different channel from the transaction data unless the transaction data uses a very secure channel. So that's an important point. Smartphone biometric data capture can be used for e-commerce transactions that are requested using the phone, or even when their request is using a different device. So the security of enrollment, data transmission, and the location of the biometric data file are key issues. What we've seen recently with the rollout of at least one new payment service, one new mobile payment service, is the security and controls in the enrollment process is today as or more critical than the actual authentication process. And if you think about this for a second, you'll understand that whatever it is what you enroll is what you're going to authenticate against, and therefore the enrollment process becomes very critical. And I think we've also heard or been part of discussions about the security and privacy concerns that surround biometric data. So it's important when you think about implementing biometrics that you think about the population that you are going to ask to give you their biometric information. How are you going to address the security and privacy concerns? So those are the 4 authentication methods that scored the best by a reasonable margin. And I'll now turn it over to Niraj, who will review the fraud tools that scored well.
Great, Rod. Appreciate it. Really good overview there of the authentication methods that we assessed. As Rod said, I'll get into fraud prevention tools. And just for context, the way that we define these, a lot of these can be, we realize a little confusing. When we talk about fraud prevention tools, really what we're talking about are those techniques that are implemented really in line with the actual payment versus beforehand, like an authentication method. And typically they're silent or non-intrusive to the actual end buyer. And so that's where we are here. So that's just to frame that a little bit. That's what we're talking about here. So let's get into the actual tools on the next slide here. As with any of this, sort of the backdrop, there's a very crowded industry and a very crowded space in terms of what's effective. So we boiled this area down to two main tools in the toolbox here. The first, what we call proprietary / transactional data. So kind of a mouthful there. What that, really there's when accepting a payment wherever you are across the payment stream, whether as a merchant, as an acquirer, as an issuer, there's really a great deal of data that's available, an overwhelming amount of data that's available to inform decisions, and when used properly can really be very effective in shutting down bad actors. And so that's the first thing that we'll talk about. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail on the next slide. The second, what we call validation services. These are a little bit more tried and true, using some issuer on file information like AVS or address verification and card security code to ensure that the rightful cardholder is the one making the purchase. So those are the two that we'll get into a little bit more detail on as we get into the next slide. And just a quick plug. I see Randy did let everybody know to submit questions. Please do keep those coming. We want to make sure that this is valuable for everybody here and that we field your questions. So let's move on to the next slide here. Proprietary and transactional data. As we said before, there's a great deal of rich data that's available that can be brought to bear for finding fraud. If used properly, that could mean surfacing that as a decline, using proprietary and transactional data to identify transactions that should just be rejected outright. It could also be used, and we find this pretty commonly among those dealing in hard goods, can be used as part of a review process in which a human decision maker will actually run their eyeballs over it and say whether it's a yay or a nay for that particular order. So there's a lot that can be done with this data, and actually already is. And I would imagine that among those listening on this call can attest to that merchants, acquirers, and issuers are in large part using a lot of these tools to shut down CNP fraud as it is. Just as an example, we're talking about something that falls into the proprietary data bucket here are the good old tried and true blacklist. So that could be, as you see here in the examples, that could be a list of PANs, payment cards, that have been used in fraud attacks beforehand. It could be looking at email addresses, IP addresses, ship-to addresses of those involved in an attack. So that's admittedly rudimentary, but certainly an example of proprietary data that could be used for identifying fraudulent transactions. So that's the heart of it. Now there's a lot of room. There's a lot of different sources, and to the point where it can be very confusing as to how to really wield all of this data, this proprietary data, this transactional data. So what we put together on the next slide here is simply a framework. It's not meant to be exhaustive in terms of the examples, but just a framework for how to approach organizing all these different really powerful data points that can be used. So moving, and again, there's lots of options. We're just going to talk framework here. Moving left to right, let's look on the left side. Those are sort of the different data sources that can be used as input. So in the top left, data collected real time. What we're talking about here are aspects of the payment. It could be the card that's being used for the payment. It could be, as Rod described earlier, it could be via device fingerprinting. It could be some information about the device itself, the laptop, the tablet, the phone, the computer. It could be shipped to information. Anything that's sort of being collected in the moment falls under this real-time data collection bucket. If we move down from there, we talk about data from industry. Now, this could be typically what we refer to as consortium data. Now, this can be a way in which data can be gleaned from a collaboration across industry, whether that's merchants, acquirers, or issuers. Because as we know, fraudsters are very good at going from point to point and attacking merchants and kind of distributing their attacks. There are proprietary sources, there are vendors that offer this information, but when used in a timely fashion, can be very effective. So that's what we talk about with data from industry. Then finally, data collected real time. Data collected over time. That's what I was referring to as sort of in-house proprietary data. It could be in the form of a negative or a positive database or a black and white list. As we talk about, that could be, it's the modern day equivalent of the sign hanging over a cash register that says, "Do not take checks from this person." Right? That's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about a negative database. Or positive one could be those VIP customers that I never want to run afoul of a fraud check. So there's a lot of different data sources. To organize them, one approach is to identify which of those describe typical purchase behavior for you and your customers, and what is atypical. For instance, the typical purchase behavior for somebody dealing in furniture is going to be very different than somebody dealing in digital downloads. And so that's where it's really important to define what's relevant to you as a merchant, acquirer, or issuer, and thus what's actionable. And then finally, we talk about aggregation. That is dealing in, taking all these signals, putting them all together, and finally spitting out something actionable. That could be in the form of a score. It could be something in the form of something more sophisticated, like an analytical model. But the point is, it's a big blender putting together all these rich data points from industry, from the transaction, from in-house, and putting together a decision. So then again, just a framework, but hopefully one that's helpful, and happy to field questions. So let's move on to the next slide. We'll talk about our second fraud prevention tool. This should be new to nobody. But when AVS and card security code are validation services that use data provided by the buyer and bounce it against what the issuers have on file to do a first pass at ensuring the rightful cardholder is the one who's actually submitting the payment. AVS, address verification service, it uses street and or zip code by and large to validate against that. It's widely used across the United States. Service is expanding, and there is some international participation, but by and large, this is a United States specific tool. The other tool here, card security code. This is a code that's displayed and printed in some fashion on the card, and the idea there is it's another piece of data that a cardholder has to have in order to ensure appropriate purchase. These are traditional methods. They can be very effective, especially as part of a layered approach. But we have found that their utility has has diminished somewhat over time, simply because there's a great deal more data that's out there on the black market, out there exposed by breaches. So again, important, but by itself found to be less than sufficient unto itself. So that's what we found with validation services. Now with that, we've talked about our fraud prevention tools. I'm going to bounce it back to Rod here. He's going to speak to another really great tool in the toolbox.
Thank you, Niraj. I'm going to talk about tokenization. And it's important when we talk about tokenization to know that it is a tool that helps prevent data from being misused. In a broad basis, it's not a particular tool to use to prevent a fraud in a specific transaction. Rather broadly, it prevents inappropriate use of data in general. So if we look at the next slide, thank you. Tokenization, as shown in this slide, secures payment data by replacing the PAN with another typically numeric value, often called a surrogate value, and often also called a token. The tokenized data cannot be used to initiate payment transactions, and therefore is not useful to fraudsters. So you can think about this for data at rest in a large database, let's say retailer's large database as an example. And so if you tokenize the PAN, that if you substitute a non-card number for the card numbers that are in the database, someone who hacks the system will not find data in the database that's useful in performing transactions. So if we go to the next slide, as we already said, the tokenized data secures payment data by replacing the PAN with another value. And the card numbers, the PANs and tokens, are typically stored in a secure token vault, so you can go back and forth. When you need the PAN, you can submit the token, and the secure token vault will provide the PAN to you. So in the current models, the PAN is in the clear in some portion of the payment chain. These are the models that are currently implemented, and therefore you have to have additional fraud prevention techniques in addition to tokenization in order to be end-to-end secure. Several other token models have been proposed, but only a limited number of models are currently in use. Some of the proposed token models impact existing processes for chargebacks, refunds, returns, and reversals. So you need to be careful about which tokenization technique you implement and how it impacts the operation, the total operation. So it's not only in terms of the what you're storing or what you're authorizing, the transaction that you're authorizing, but also the other functions in a typical retail or commercial or general commercial environment. So I'll turn the webinar back to Niraj, who will discuss the 3D Secure.
Great. Thanks, Rod. So let's get into 3D Secure, and actually if we could just flip to the next slide, that'd be appreciated. Thank you. So 3D Secure, as a whole, really at the end of the day, it comes down to another flavor of authentication. But we broke this out as part of this working committee as a separate section because its specifics are unique enough, really, and we'll get into why that is in just a second. So really, what 3DS is, it's a way for actual buyers and the issuers to interact during the course of a transaction to authenticate a cardholder. And this was a somewhat unique concept And what 3DS does is enable this conversation. Just sort of speaking in analogy here, it sort of provides that highway for that conversation. So, this is something that's not altogether new. It already exists actually in the form of, for example, and you see some examples there on this slide in front of you, verified by Visa, MasterCard's Secure Code, and American Express SafeKey. This is also something that's, as Francine described earlier, it's been implemented abroad, with some significant success. So let's talk a little bit more about 3DS and what the specifics are. If we can get to the next slide. So again, 3DS, it's probably a poor analogy, but it sets up a highway, provides a framework for authentication, and what that allows for is authentication methods to be built on top of that highway. While static password is pretty common, right? With saying, kind of like going to an ATM, right? You know your PIN for your ATM card as a card holder, and that's what you'll put in each time when you're quote challenged or prompted for that PIN. But that's not the extent of it. Rod did a great job of covering authentication methods beforehand. So not just static passwords, but also one-time passwords, biometric authentication, etc. And those can all also be built on top of this 3DS protocol. And it's really up to the issuers and the participators as to how that works. And so again, that's why we felt, given that it's sort of a protocol on top of which authentication is built, that it deserved its own section. Let's go to the next slide. I think we're not going to get into this in detail. It's certainly something that we can get into, if there are questions about it. But just a little bit more background. So A, as to the name, but B, as to how it works. What 3D Secure is named for are 3 different domains. That's the 3 in the D. There is the issuer domain, sort of the interoperability domain. That's what the payment networks are orchestrating, kind of in the middle. And then finally the acquirer domain. And while there's a lot of arrows and there's a lot of data going back and forth, but when you look at the left of this slide, in that issuer domain box, where the purchaser is talking directly to is talking to the issuing bank to provide authentication information, and that's really what's distinct about 3D Secure. That could be in the form of a password, but some sort of credential to authenticate the cardholder. And that's really the real powerful piece here of 3D Secure. Now 3D Secure, and we'll move to the next slide and get into a little bit more detail. 3D Secure is something that some merchants and issuers and acquirers support here in the United States. It's been far more accepted by consumers globally. But the experience that we've had here in the United States is that when every transaction is authenticated, meaning every time you go into a participating merchant site, the buyer would have to provide information. Some merchants have found that to take away from conversion. It's gotten a bad rap as far as taking away from top line, and that's certainly something that is has made merchants shy away from supporting it. Now that hasn't gone unnoticed. So we're in the midst of the 2.0 specification of 3D Secure being driven by EMV Co. And what that does is it introduces a risk-based model in which and the numbers are I don't have the particular numbers on hand, but there will be not every cardholder or every purchase attempt would require the customer to be prompted. Really, what would happen is there'd be some back-end intel that would say, okay, 9 out of 10 customers, just as an example, are going to be good, and I'm not going to, I'm going to leave them alone. They're going to flow through, be able to make a purchase, and do that without being interrupted. But that 10th customer that might have insufficient data or have conflicting data around how reputable they are might be challenged. So that's a way to sort of get the best of both worlds, leaving the unchallenged or leaving the safe on their own and uninterrupted, but then allowing for more secure authentication and more powerful authentication for those that are a little bit riskier. That's what we're seeing with 3DDS 2.0. It's certainly promising, and it warrants watching as it rolls out in earnest in the coming months and year. So hopefully that was a helpful overview of 3DS. And I see a question there's about the expense of CNP fraud. We can get to it more specifically, but really by and large, the liability in a CNP fraud transaction is borne by the merchant, given the lack of data that's captured like signature. But in any case, with that said, I'm going to kick it back to Francine, who is going to do a little bit of wrap up here on what we're talking about.
Thank you, Niraj. Well, now that Rod and Niraj have gone over the prevailing authentication methods and fraud tools, what does this mean? I mean, for everybody listening and for the merchants, the issuers, I mean, practically what happens now? So at the end of the day, to reduce the exposure to card-not-present fraud, everybody has to work together. Merchants, acquirers, financial institutions, everybody needs to secure the sensitive data elements that are handled during transaction life cycles. They also need to be aware of the impact on users, and that was kind of dealt with in the methods that we presented, and you can find more information in the white paper, but that's why those came as the top ones, because eventually they seem to be, potentially a little bit better in that way. But at the end of the day, you need to pay attention to the increased transaction times or tactics that make the transaction completion more difficult, since that would have a negative impact. As you can see in the diversity in tools and methods, and we only showcase, like, again, some of them, there's no silver bullet. No single security mechanism can protect against all possible fraud scenarios, and some tools are actually better suited for specific stakeholders. So at the end of the day, you need a systematic, layered approach. That's what needs to be implemented to secure all transaction data. Those layers of security need to be able to protect the sensitive data for the entire duration of the transaction. And that's something that you should not forget. It's not just at one point in time. And when properly implemented, those approaches usually ensure that compromising a single data element will not affect the integrity of the other elements. So for instance, I mean, and this is, one scenario among so many others, and it probably exists already today in various, merchants, issuers, and so on, scenarios when you actually go online. So if you were to introduce device authentication, a merchant could greatly reduce their exposure to fraud before a transaction is actually presented for authorization. Then, to further reduce the exposure, an issuer could implement multi-factor authentication. Niraj was telling how you can do that with 3D Secure, and in other ways also. Then once a transaction is approved to be presented for authorization, tokenization, as described by Rod, can be performed to protect sensitive data both in transit and eventually at rest within the merchant environment. And then fraud tools, as Niraj explained, can be used at different points within the payment cycle to flag suspicious or risky transactions before final authorization. So it seems rather daunting. I mean, we've only covered some of them, the best ones, and there's a lot of things out there, but it is necessary. If nothing is done, card-not-present fraud will materially impact institutions, and that's going to impact the whole industry. Merchants, issuers, and then the overall, online commerce, which is such a big thing today. So merchants, acquirers, FIs are strongly encouraged to plan on phasing in, so everything doesn't happen at once, but phasing in these techniques and other security practices. It's a high business, it's a priority in this environment. And ideally, all of those stakeholders should address card-not-present fraud in conjunction with the EMV chip migration strategy, not after the fact. Otherwise, as I explained at the beginning, we saw what happened in other countries where it was EMV first and then card-not-present, and the fact is it skyrocketed before going down. So I'd like to remind everybody that the tools and methods that we presented today deal with current threats and if they are actually available today. But let's not fool ourselves. The bad guys out there, they're not just going to wait and keep on using the same methods. I mean, if a door is locked, they're going to try to open another door. They're also going to become smarter. So those technologies we talked about may disappear, may evolve over time, and new ones will come on the market. So just like none of us keep a laptop for 10 years, all the stakeholders need to constantly be on top of those new threats and look at the solutions out there in the market. And a last reminder, Randy mentioned that at the beginning, is that you can find more details, impact on stakeholders, and so on and so forth, of those various authentication methods in the white paper, which is available to all of you. And I think this is my conclusion. And at this point in time, I think we'll give it back to Randy for the Q&A section. Randy?
Sorry, everyone, I was on mute. Thank you, Francine, and also thank you, Rodman and Niraj, for a great presentation today. We have received a couple of questions that have come in. If any of you have more questions, please type them in now, and we'll take as many questions as possible in the time we have left, and then we will be forwarding you a link to the content as well as the audio recording for this webinar so that you'll be able to replay it or share this with any of your colleagues shortly after the webinar is concluded. So our first question I'd like to ask is to Rodman, and a question came up with regard to who is responsible for fraud in the card-not-present channels today. And does the use of 3DS or any of these other tools impact on the fraud liability of merchants?
Okay. So the answer is that today, in general, fraud liability is the responsibility of the e-commerce merchant. And there are some opportunities to mitigate that, but it really varies by the specific brands and their specific rules. And for 3DS, I'll turn that question over to Niraj.
Yeah, thanks, Rod. So, with 3DS as it exists, it's difficult to speak in broad strokes simply because every card brand is a little different. And as kind of Rod alluded to, there's certainly nuances, but by and large, if a transaction has been authenticated by 3DS, it would shift that liability to the issuing bank. If they've provided the rail, if everybody's participating across the payment stream, that would shift that to the bank.
Okay, terrific. Next question is about being able to use these tools across multiple geographic regions. So online sales reaches a global audience, both as merchants who sell as well as consumers where they shop. So how important is it for the card-not-present tools to be available that they can be used in a global setting? And I'll open that question up to anyone.
Yeah, I'll handle the first piece of that. It's Rod. It is very important. However, certain tools are more applicable in certain corridors than others. So, for example, if you look at AVS, which has been out there for a long time, there are certain countries where the issuers participate in AVS, in address verification, and in many countries they do not. So it's really corridor by corridor and country by country in terms of which tools are important and which are less important. And that also applies to some of the rules because each of the regions will have slightly different rules depending upon the specific environment. That unfortunately doesn't help a merchant who would like one specific answer to say, how do I do business across the globe? And it would be nice if it were that way, where there are one set of rules globally, but unfortunately there are nuances and important nuances in terms of risk by region and by brand.
Yeah, just one thing to add. Really great response there. I mean, one thing to add is that to break it down from another standpoint, fraudsters are everywhere too. I have I'm working with a merchant who markets to 2 countries, U.S. and Canada, and that's it. But we saw after implementing some techniques, they were seeing transactions coming from 191 different countries across the globe after implementing some transactional data checks. Fraudsters are everywhere. They operate from different hotbeds and they cloak their identity. But because of that, I think a global mindset, I think the risk of sounding cliche, I think a global mindset is absolutely important. But to Rod's point, what particular techniques to think globally, will vary. But absolutely, they're operating everywhere.
Great.
A great answer, both of you. So this is a question for you, Niraj. You talked about some of the lists of bad actors, bad IP addresses, etc. Does someone who has those lists, is there a mechanism for sharing that data across all of the stakeholders? And if so, how do merchants participate in getting access to those lists?
Yeah, great question. So, obviously my experience is going to be, it's going to be based on my experience here. So, what I have found is that there certainly are, fraudsters are very well funded, they're very organized, and it takes an organized approach to counter their exploits. And I found that we have seen consortiums spin up. I mean, I'm not going to get into specific names, but there are a lot of whether they're pure play vendor, acquire, issuer backed data pools, data consortiums. There certainly are those that exist, and I think that's an approach that I've seen pretty much across the industry. Is that it's about building out a network effect. So that's what I've seen to be a great resource for merchants to tap into for exactly those kind of data points to use real time. Email address, card, device, IP, etc. So they exist, and typically I've seen them as part of larger offerings. I think the issuers, card brands do contribute a bit, though of course their bread and butter is mainly going to be around card. So there is some information post deposit that can be gleaned that is shared with acquirers. But again, that's going to be limited to card, and it's going to be after deposit. So real time, I would say that there are consortiums that can be tapped into.
Terrific. This is a question for Francine, and Francine, you had some really great statistics at the opening slides about the use of 3DS in other countries and how that managed fraud. So if 3DS, for instance, in the UK was introduced in 2008, why isn't that just the standard for use across all markets, and why has it taken so long for the US to develop the use for this technology?
Actually, this is a very good question, Randy. I think we talked about the regional aspect or lack of international, should I say, standards. When it comes to 3DS, I mean, it might be an international standard, but then there's what's more acceptable in one country and in another. So in some countries, it's pretty easy to impose a technology, and whether people like it or not, that's what they're going to use. In other countries, that doesn't work as well. The US is one of those where the customer experience is paramount. And so in the original version, and should I say the current version of 3D Secure, and in the abandonment rate was rather high because the experience was not really seamless. So eventually it kind of deterred from further adoption. That being said, when it is implemented, and especially with a two-factor authentication versus static, because if you put your birth date, anybody can find that on the internet, that eventually reinforces, the security and makes it a pretty compelling tool. So as Niraj explained, the new version coming up being a little bit more, should I say, risk-based, that might be something to consider. And I also understand that the interface has changed, which means also prompted for a lot of abandonment. So at this point in time, I think the U.S. is, like they're the last ones to migrate to EMV. They also had, kind of issues with the current implementation of 3DS, but that might change.
Terrific. Thank you. Rodman, there was a question about biometrics use, and can you share any examples of where biometrics are being used today to protect card-not-present fraud channels?
Sure. You have both Apple Pay and Samsung Pay are examples of the use of biometrics today for card-not-present transactions, and particularly in both cases for the use of those two techniques within apps that are on those phones.
Okay, so biometrics are coming, and the changing of the way in which consumers are shopping, it's actually lending itself to the emerging channels more so than the existing channels. Very good. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to address this one to Francine, since you represent a technology associated with cards, and in particular, since we're in an environment of issuing EMV cards. What are some of the barriers to further adoption of cards equipped with either dynamic CVV or displays that would help address the use of those cards in card-not-present channels?
Thank you, Randy. That's actually a very good question. So I'll just clarify, there's two types of products. There's the standard, what we refer to as a display card, with or without a keypad, which means PIN-protected access to the one-time password. The U.S., again, migrating to EMV just now has not really focused on this card-not-present environment and has not done much, though we have references in the U.S. Abroad, there have been a lot of implementations because in some countries it's actually mandatory. 2FA, not specifically our technology. That being said, for an issuer, it makes a lot of sense to potentially give something that would be on your card, since you're still going to use it in a lot of cases, despite the advent of mobile commerce and so on and so forth. So that's the one-time password card that can be used in conjunction, for instance, with 3D Secure or to access online banking if implemented that way. When it comes to pure card-not-present environment, however, the latest product is the dynamic CVV, and it was mentioned a little bit earlier, and that is something, again, that is, it's very sophisticated, it's new, so there's implementations, pilots going on in other countries right now, and I think the barrier to entry is potentially cost compared to some of the, online, web-based or phone-based solutions. So again, it's like every technology, an issuer, the stakeholders have to do their ROI, look what it means for the cardholder, look at what it means for them, their level of fraud, and then decide whether it's the right solution for them or not.
I'll add one thing to that, and that's that if you look at dynamic CVV or the dynamic one-time PIN with the keyboard, both of those are applicable not only to e-commerce, but if you think about it for a second, they're also applicable to mail order and telephone order, which makes them interesting technologies, different from the other things that we've talked about here.
Thanks, Rod. That's correct.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have today for our webinar. I want to thank you all for your participation today and for your great questions. I want to thank our panelists, Francine Dubois, Rodman Reif, and Niraj Gupta for their contributions to this. For those of you who would like additional information, I encourage you to go to the EMV Migration Forum resource page on emvconnection.com. Also, gochipcard.com is a great site where consumers, merchants, and issuers can get information about educating their customers with about EMV, and there's great resources about card not present as well. Thank you again for all of your contributions for the webinar today, and you should receive an email communication from us shortly with a link to where you'll be able to download the slides you saw today and also be able to get a playback of today's content. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon or morning where you live, and we'll talk at you soon. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.